I have always believed that the smallest details of life reveal who we are more than any grand event or ceremony. For me, mornings are the truest mirror of my existence. Every day, without exception, I wake at 6:30, not because anyone expects me to, but because my body has trained itself through decades of routine. I spent 42 years working as a bookkeeper at a manufacturing company, rising before dawn, walking through snow or rain, balancing ledgers and accounts until numbers felt like blood in my veins. When I finally retired, my wife still kept that same schedule, preparing coffee before I stirred, laying out breakfast with an instinctive grace that I never questioned. After she died 7 years ago, the rituals remained, but they became lonely repetitions. Now I make the coffee myself, measuring the grounds, waiting for the kettle to whistle, letting the bitterness coat my tongue in silence. I sit at the same kitchen table where we once sat together, where she used to read the newspaper aloud to me, and where our daughter once scattered crayons and homework assignments. The table feels larger than ever, the chairs emptier than they should. That is the beginning of every day, and, if I'm honest, it is also the beginning of my confession. The truth is, I have been growing smaller, while the world around me keeps expanding into noise I can hardly recognize. My neighbors are younger now, people who look through me as if I am transparent. They do not see the man I was, the years I carried on my back, or the quiet discipline that sustained me. They see only the slowness in my steps, the way I fumble with keys, the way I sometimes forget why I walked into a room. And my family, what little of it is left in my life, has adopted that same vision. My daughter calls rarely, my son-in-law even less, and when they do, it is never about how I am. It is about what I can give, what account I can sign, what favor I can extend. They speak to me as if my wallet is more alive than I am. There was a time I would have given gladly, believing it was part of a father's duty. But over the years, I began to sense the difference between generosity and exploitation. It is an ugly thing realizing your own children treat you not as a father, but as a resource. Still, despite everything, I clung to the faint hope that one day they would remember me, not as an obstacle or a bank, but as a man who raised them, loved them, and taught them the very skills that carried them into their lives. That fragile hope is what kept me answering their calls, writing checks, forgiving their silences, swallowing the humiliation when they forgot birthdays or ignored holidays. It is what made me keep a suit pressed in my closet, just in case there was ever an invitation to a dinner or a gathering where they would want me present, even if only for appearances. I am old, yes, but I am not blind to my own longing. Even after years of rejection, a father remains a father. My house has become a museum of reminders. The walls hold photographs of better times, frozen smiles that seem almost dishonest now. In the living room stands an old piano, untouched since my wife's death, because she was the one who played it, and I could never bring myself to sell it or hear anyone else's fingers on those keys. In the corner rests a wicker basket that once held our dog's toys, though the dog himself has been gone for decades. Sometimes I catch myself staring at that basket as if expecting him to walk back in from the yard, tail wagging, dropping a ball at my feet. These objects haunt me not because they are painful, but because they remind me of who I was when life still had a rhythm of togetherness. The neighborhood children sometimes pass by my window, laughing in ways my grandchildren never did around me. I wonder if they too will grow into adults who turn their backs on the very hands that fed them. I wonder if my grandchildren already have. They are grown now, out of state, with studies and friends I have never met. Birthdays pass with no phone call. Holidays come with excuses about flights, exams, expenses. I do not blame them as much as I blame the example set by their parents. A child learns what is valued by watching how his own parents treat their elders. My daughter and her husband taught them that I am disposable. I have grown accustomed to the silence, but not immune to it. There are nights when the quiet presses on me like a physical weight, when I hear the house creak and mistake it for the sound of my wife's footsteps, when I find myself speaking aloud just to remember the cadence of a voice in the room. I read books more slowly now, not because my eyesight is worse, though it is, but because I try to stretch out the companionship of words. The television often runs in the background not for entertainment, but to simulate the presence of another human being. Loneliness is not a loud condition, it is an erosion. a steady chipping away at the core of your being until you feel like dust carried by a draft. Despite this, I maintain the appearance of dignity. I keep my lawn trimmed, my shirts ironed, my shoes polished. When I go to the grocery store, I smile at the cashier, exchange pleasantries, pretend as if life is orderly and calm. People do not want to hear about sorrow. They avert their gaze when confronted with decay, with the inevitability of decline. And so I let them see the mask, while inside I carry the truth. I am waiting, not for death, but for acknowledgement, a recognition that my existence still matters. This confession may sound bitter, and perhaps it is, but bitterness grows in soil watered by neglect. Still, I have not surrendered hope completely. That is why, when my daughter called last week with an invitation to dinner at her house, I felt something in my chest stir, like a bird long thought dead. She said it casually, as though it were nothing unusual, but to me it was as if the world tilted back into balance for a moment. I imagined us sitting at a table together, speaking not of money or inconvenience, but of memories, of family, of shared life. I pressed my old suit again, polished the same shoes I once wore to her wedding, rehearsed what I might say if the conversation faltered. I told myself this dinner could be the bridge back to something I thought lost forever. I know it sounds foolish, after so many years of slights and disappointments, to still hold on to such hope. But I'm not ashamed of that. Hope is not weakness. It is the only weapon left for a man who has already lost so much. Perhaps this dinner will change nothing. Perhaps it will only reopen wounds, but I must go, because if I do not, I will always wonder whether I missed the last chance to reclaim my family before time finishes erasing the little I have left. On the afternoon of the dinner, I stood longer than necessary in front of the mirror and tried to smooth the waviness out of a tie that had been knotted and unknotted so many times it had learned my hands better than I had. Then I put on the dark jacket that still carried the faint scent of cedar from the closet and the lighter, sadder ghost of my wife's perfume that the years had not quite erased, and I told myself that an old man can still arrive someplace looking like a whole person if he makes the effort. I set the pie I had bought from the church bake sale, apple, with a lattice my wife would have fixed with a finger in the sugar, into a paper bag, and I walked outside where the evening had the brittle brightness of late fall, the kind of light that seems to insist on clarity, and I waited on the curb because my daughter had said she would send her husband to pick me up, which he did, arriving 10 minutes late in a truck that smelled like detailing chemicals and impatience, and when I climbed in, he said we were cutting it close because the roast had a schedule, as if the whole night revolved around a clock that was his alone to read, and I laughed softly to make the joke friendly and told him I was happy to be included, which earned me a quick nod that died before it reached his eyes. The house, when we pulled up, was one of those new places that pretends to be old by stapling on shutters and cladding the porch columns with stone. Behind the big windows, I could see a television throwing blue light across the foyer and hear the dog bark in that rhythmic, metronomic way that says he has been trained to announce without believing in his own alarms. And when my daughter opened the door, she was already turning away to call to someone in the kitchen, telling them to reduce the heat. And check the carrots, then she hugged me with her arms and not her chest and told me how handsome I looked, that navy had always been my color, and I handed her the pie and said it was nothing special, but it was sweet. And she thanked me without looking at it and passed it to my grandson, who took it as if it were an errand only he had drawn the short straw for. The entryway smelled of lemon polish and bleach and something meaty beneath those cleaner smells, a scent that was both familiar and not, the sort of savory tinned heaviness you get from a can opened too long ago. In the kitchen, everything was bright and orderly, the counters wiped dry and the knives set like a line of soldiers, and on the island stood a wooden board with slices of something pale and soft arranged in a fan, a small ramekin of mustard and a sprinkle of chopped parsley that had been thrown on top to make it look deliberate, and my daughter said she'd found a French pâté at a specialty market that had been marked down because the date was today, and wasn't that our luck? And would I like to try a bite while she checked? The roast. I said that I would, because I am not rude, and because I wanted to give her every chance to be the daughter I still kept folded like a photograph inside my chest. And I put a thin slice on a cracker and tasted, and at once there was that strangely metallic brightness, the sort of tang you cannot name, but that announces itself differently from the softness of liver or the sweetness of ham. I chewed and I smiled, and I said it was interesting, and she replied that my palate had always been conservative, that I had never really learned to enjoy European flavors, and I said perhaps that was true, and took another bite because conceding to someone else's certainty has been a habit of mine since before she was born. The dog nosed around my ankle, a curly-haired thing with a name that sounded like a designer brand, and when I bent to scratch him behind the ear, I noticed his stainless steel bowl on a small mat by the pantry door, glossy clean except for a clinging. Smear the color of the slices on the board, and next to the bowl sat 2 unopened cans with tasteful labels. No cartoon bone or grinning dog, just restrained typography promising heritage beef stew with carrots and brown rice. The sort of marketing that flatters the buyer more than it feeds the animal. And for reasons I could not articulate, I felt my face grow warm as if a hand had pressed it there from the inside, and I stood and said the dog looked well cared for, and my daughter said of course, he eats better than most people because quality matters, and with that she laughed toward the living room, where my son-in-law asked if the game had started yet, and my grandson called back that the pregame was still on, and my granddaughter, who was now old enough to wear an expression of practiced weariness, asked if she could eat in her room later because she had an exam, to which her mother said we were having a family dinner, and she needed to remember what that felt like. I moved around the kitchen slowly, not wanting to be in the way but wanting to be useful, and reached for the drawer with the napkins and was corrected. "Those are guest napkins, Dad. We'll use the regular ones." And then I tried to help with the salad and was told the dressing was already measured, and so I took up the water pitcher and was permitted to pour, which I did, watching the bubbles climb up the sides of the glasses while I listened to the oven fan whistle and the dog settle onto the mat. With a sigh, and in the steady breathing of that animal, I heard something that was not quite mockery and not quite innocence, a sound like comfort that does not need anyone's permission to exist. At the table they had set out plates heavier than mine at home, plates with irregular rims to demonstrate their intentional imperfection, and the cutlery was the sort that comes in matte black now, as if eating were a covert operation. My seat was at the end. A place of honor in theory, though tonight it felt like the place where the overflow would go, and in front of me rested a small dish with 2 slices of the pâté and a curl of parsley that had wilted into a dark comma. I told my grandson he looked taller and asked about classes, and he gave me a thin paragraph about majors and internships that had the polished vagueness of a brochure. Then he turned back to his phone and tilted it so that the light did not reflect on his face. And my granddaughter, when I asked about the exam, told me a title that might as well have been a foreign language, and I complimented her anyway, because it is the grandfather's role to believe in the future, even when he no longer recognizes the vocabulary in which it is written. My son-in-law brought the roast with a flourish that wanted us to be impressed, and to be fair, the meat looked beautiful, lacquered and glossy, and when he carved it, the knife moved without complaint, and the first slices steamed in a way that promised warmth, and I let myself feel relief because the oddness of the appetizer could be forgiven inside the comfort of something familiar. He served my daughter first, then the kids, then me. And as he set my plate down, he winked and said he had trimmed the fat because at my age one should be mindful, and I thanked him because I am a man who solves the insult by washing it in gratitude, and I lifted my fork and cut a careful bite and brought it to my mouth, and paused because the same shadow of scent that had hovered in the kitchen reached me again, not from the roast, that was fine and savory, but from the sauce spooned over the mashed potatoes, a thick brown puddle that cooled faster than it should and clung to the fork the way gelatine does when it is asked to pretend to be gravy. I tasted it, and I did not flinch, and again there was that singed tin brightness, that chalky undertone that does not belong to a stock pot but to a factory line. And when I swallowed, I glanced toward the pantry door, not meaning to, and saw that one. Of the tasteful cans was now gone, and the recycling bin, clear plastic, had the lid of a similar can nested inside a wine bottle, and I told myself not to be suspicious, that I was an old man making patterns where none existed, that cost-saving cooks stretch sauces with whatever they have at hand, and that perhaps the specialty pâté had simply bled its character into the dinner in an enthusiastic way. My daughter watched me the way one watches a baby taste lemon for the first time, head tilted, lips pressed in anticipation of my reaction, diminished sense of taste, and I assured her it was lovely, that I appreciated every effort she had made, and I lifted my glass and complimented the wine, which was not remarkable, but which wore a label that sounded expensive, and I said, "The house." Looked beautiful, and the children looked smart, and that I was proud, and I saw her shoulders relax by a degree, as if a test had been administered and I had not failed it by saying the wrong thing. After a while, the conversation found a rhythm that excluded me without being unkind. Work stories that refer to people I do not know, shows I do not watch, jokes that would die if explained. And I let my gaze soften and traveled quietly through my own. Memories? The first dinners in our starter home when we ate from plates that did not match and the dog slept under my chair. The laughter that rises when no one is trying to impress anyone. The little corrections my wife made to my posture, or the napkin in my lap that felt like love when only two people are present to understand its language. And then the dog stood and moved to my side again and rested his chin on my knee, and I smelled his breath. Not unpleasant, but unmistakably familiar too. Anyone who has ever opened a can that claims to be beef stew but arrives as a puzzle of cubes and jelly, and I understood, not entirely, not yet, but enough to feel the shift inside me where trust loosens and caution takes its place, that something in this dinner was not about welcoming me back, not about the return of a father to the table of his daughter, but about seeing what I would swallow in the name of belonging. I did not accuse, I did not stand, I did not deliver a lecture that would harden into their next grievance. I ate the roast, which was good, and I touched the sauce only lightly, and I asked for seconds of the carrots because the sweetness of a root, pulled from earth, cannot be counterfeited by a label. And when I said the pie might be nice with coffee later, my daughter's mouth twitched in a way I could not read, and she said we would see because everyone was quite full. Then she turned to her husband and asked, too casually, whether he had left the receipt from the market on the counter because she needed it for points, and he said he had tossed it, and she answered that it was a shame since the pet aisle promo could have doubled our rewards, and the word pet slid through the air like a knife cared for by someone who knew how to keep it clean, and my grandson smirked at his phone in a way that told me he was listening after all. I took a sip of water and felt the glass cool against my lip, and I told myself that I would finish this meal with the same composure with which I had entered this house, and that later, when the dishes were done and the goodbyes were said and the AV night broke open into its honest darkness, I would sit down with my own thoughts, and I would decide what a man must do when the people who share his blood ask him, without words, yet with perfect clarity, to trade his dignity for a chair at their table. I knew enough to keep my face steady, to chew the roast and swallow as if it were no different from any other dinner. But beneath the table, my hands were tightening in my lap until the knuckles shone like chalk. The conversation grew louder, tilted toward laughter that had the sour edge of mockery, and I began to realize I was not a guest that evening, not truly a father welcomed home, but rather a specimen they were poking, testing, seeing how much humiliation an old man would endure for the sake of a chair among his own blood. My grandson muttered to his sister that they should record this for later, and she smirked, lifting her phone halfway as if preparing for a photograph, but the screen was already glowing red from video. I caught the reflection in the black gloss of a cabinet and felt the cold bloom of shame spread through me, not only for myself, but for them, for how far they had fallen into cruelty dressed as comedy. My son-in-law carved another slice of meat and dropped it onto my plate with exaggerated ceremony, saying loudly that Dad always liked the cheap cuts, the leftovers, he's not picky, he'll eat anything. My daughter added, with a smile too sharp to be tender, that I had been raised in the Depression era and probably couldn't tell the difference between fine cuisine and dog chow anyway. The children giggled, repeating the phrase dog chow under their breath like a new family password, and I forced myself to sip from my glass rather than give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Yet the sauce clinging to the potatoes betrayed them again with its strange metallic tang. And when the dog nosed at my knee, licking his chops with a hunger that seemed directed not at the meat on the table but at my own plate, I understood in a sudden, terrible clarity what had been done. They had served me from the same stock they gave their pet, perhaps mixed into the gravy or sliced neatly and dressed with parsley, as though dignity could be erased by seasoning. Still I said nothing. A man can endure insults, but what corrodes is when those insults are witnessed by others and left unanswered. My granddaughter leaned across the table, her eyes bright with the intoxication of cruelty, and asked me whether I found the meal delicious, whether it reminded me of the stews I used to make when money was tighter. I looked at her, and for a moment I almost did not recognize her as family, but as some stranger who had never known my lap or my bedtime stories. I answered simply that the carrots were excellent, and the silence that followed was heavier than any insult because it left them uncertain whether I had truly swallowed their cruelty or whether I had seen through it. My daughter recovered quickly, patting my hand with feigned affection and saying that it was good to see me enjoying myself, her nails pressing just hard enough to leave little half-moon dents in my skin. And I wondered when a touch meant to. Comfort had become a weapon to assert control. The evening dragged into a farce of civility. They spoke of vacations they planned without me, of purchases made with money I had once provided, of investments they were considering that sounded suspiciously like schemes. I noticed the glances between husband and wife when expenses were mentioned, the subtle checks to see whether I was listening, whether I might still be useful as a source of funds. It dawned on me then that the humiliation at the table was not an accident, but a measurement. They were gauging how far they could push me, how much pride I was willing to forfeit in exchange for their company. If I could eat the food meant for a dog and thank them for it, then perhaps I could be maneuvered into signing papers, transferring accounts, surrendering the remnants of my independence with the same meek gratitude. When dessert was finally brought out, my pie, sliced thin and placed on plates that looked more like afterthoughts than offerings, they did not serve me first. They served the children, then themselves, leaving my plate last as though hierarchy had been rearranged, and I had slipped to the bottom. The pie was familiar, sweet, and soft, but I tasted nothing. My thoughts were on the phone still resting in my granddaughter's palm, the video she had taken, and the certainty that soon it would be shared, perhaps with friends, perhaps with strangers, a spectacle of an old man tricked into eating dog food, while his family laughed. I imagined the comments, the laughter, the way the moment would be replayed again and again, until my humiliation became permanent. And yet, through the tightening in my chest and the burn in my throat, I also felt something else begin to stir. Not just anger, but clarity. They thought I was weak, too desperate for love to resist, too diminished to defend myself. But humiliation, once it reaches a certain depth, no longer destroys. It hardens. And as I sat there, nodding politely, forcing one more bite of pie, I realized the game had shifted. They believed they had stripped me of dignity, but in truth they had revealed themselves completely. I would remember every smirk, every whispered joke, every cruel glance toward the pantry door. I would remember it all, and when the moment came, I would not answer with shouting or tears. I would answer in a language they understood far less than ridicule, the language of justice, patient and final. The evening should have ended there with coffee cooling in mugs and polite farewells at the door, but instead it turned into a theater of exposure, a stage where my own family decided to test how much further they could push the boundaries of humiliation without breaking me entirely. After the plates had been cleared, my son-in-law leaned back in his chair with the lazy swagger of a man who believes he owns the room and said that since I was there, it was the perfect opportunity to discuss arrangements for the future. A phrase that immediately sent a cold vibration through my bones because I knew it meant money, deeds, and signatures rather than any concern for health or companionship. My daughter brought out a folder from the sideboard, too smooth in her movements, too rehearsed in her smile, and she slid it toward me on the table as if it were merely a set of harmless documents needing a father's blessing. I did not open it right away, and that hesitation alone drew her irritation, her voice sharpening as she insisted that I at least look, that it was simply to simplify inheritance issues, a phrase that stung because it carried the unspoken suggestion that I was already as good as gone, already a man to be divided on paper before his body had cooled. I opened the folder and scanned the first page, my eyes blurring a little in the light, but clear enough to see the words "transfer of title" and "living trust" staring back at me. It was written in the sly language of bureaucracy, pretending to offer protection, while, in truth, it placed every asset I owned under their control. My house, my savings, even my modest pension would have been redirected through them for management purposes, leaving me not the master of my own life, but a dependent signing away the remnants of independence. My hand trembled slightly as I closed the folder, not from weakness, but from the recognition that what I had long suspected was true. The dog food and the sauce had been no isolated prank, but a deliberate prelude, a test of obedience before the final demand of surrender. When I told them calmly that I would not sign, the air shifted at once, like a curtain drawn back to reveal actors who had grown tired of playing kindness. My daughter's smile flattened into something brittle, her husband's jaw tightened, and the children smirked openly, the performance no longer needed. She said I was being paranoid, that I had always been suspicious, that it was for my own safety. Because what if something happened? What if I fell ill? What if I forgot to pay bills or left the stove on? She said it with the tone of a caretaker, but behind every word was accusation, an insinuation that I was already incompetent. I reminded her, with as much steadiness as I could, that I still lived alone, still managed my own accounts, still cooked my own meals and walked without aid, but she waved it off as denial, pointing out that I had mistaken the sauce for something. Unpleasant that perhaps my taste buds were failing, that memory, too, was a fragile thing at my age. My son-in-law added that it was time for me to stop pretending I could do everything myself, that responsible men know when to pass the torch, and the way he said torch sounded less like a symbol of guidance and more like a burden to be dropped. The children laughed then in that casual, cruel way that only the young can, unafraid of age because they have never felt it. My grandson suggested maybe I should just live with them, that they could set me up in the spare room where the dog slept, and he said it as a joke, but no one contradicted him, and I saw in my daughter's eyes that she was weighing it, considering how convenient it might be to reduce her father to a dependent presence in the corner of her house. The image struck me like a blow, myself lying on a cot that smelled of kibble and bleach, my days reduced to waiting for scraps, my dignity dissolved completely. I set the folder back on the table and told them firmly that I was tired and would be leaving, and for a moment no one moved, the silence thick with disappointment and threat. My son-in-law finally said that refusing to cooperate was only making things harder for everyone, that in the long run the law would side with practicality, not sentiment. My daughter sighed heavily, as if I were an obstinate child refusing to eat his vegetables, and she told me to sleep on it to reconsider, that she would call me in a few days to see if I had regained reason. I gathered my coat slowly, unwilling to show haste, unwilling to let them see fear. And when I reached the door, my granddaughter lifted her phone once more and snapped a photo without asking, catching me in profile like a criminal in a mugshot. I heard her whisper to her brother that it would be perfect for the group chat, and they both laughed, not realizing or perhaps not caring that the man they mocked was the very one whose sweat and years had made their comforts possible. Walking out into the night, the air cool and unsparing, I felt no relief, only the throb of betrayal pressing against my ribs. The streetlights stretched my shadow thin and bent, and I thought of my wife, how she would have wept to see her family turn into predators circling the man she once called her rock. I understood then that the center of the conflict had shifted. No longer was it about loneliness or neglect. It was about survival of self. They had tested me with humiliation, they had pressed me with papers, and when I refused, they had already begun rewriting the story of my mind, planting seeds of incompetence to justify what they planned to take. It was no longer a question of if they would try again, but when, and whether I would be ready to defend myself. That night I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, replaying every word, every smirk, every glance, until the truth hardened into resolve. The midpoint of my life as their pawn had ended. Whatever years remained to me would not be lived under their mockery or their signatures. They had crossed the line from neglect into active violation, and though I had no clear plan yet, I knew that when the time came I would answer not as a frightened old man begging for kindness, but as the last custodian of my own dignity. They thought they had stripped me bare, but all they had done was awaken the one part of me they had underestimated, the part that still remembered how to fight, not with fists or with rage, but with patience, with quiet justice, with a long memory of a father who had been forced too far. I did not sleep the night after the folders slid across their table like a quiet knife. I lay on my back and listened to the old house speak its drafts and clicks while the dark pressed close to my face. And I tried to understand the exact moment when neglect had ripened into predation, when the children I carried on my shoulders decided to climb those same shoulders only to push me down the stairs of my final years. And at dawn I rose with a clarity that was not angry, but surgical, made coffee so strong it bit the skin of my tongue, and planned to call my doctor only to find a voicemail already waiting. That informed me, in a bright administrative voice, that my daughter had scheduled a cognitive assessment for the following Tuesday, and that forms for a durable power of attorney would be prepared should the provider deem it appropriate. And I stood in the kitchen with the sun cutting a thin blade across the counter and felt, not fear exactly, but the coolness of someone else's hands, trying to rearrange my life under the cover of help. When the doorbell rang at 9, 2 uniformed officers stood on my step with a welfare check report, apologetic but resolute, explaining that a concerned relative had called to say I was disoriented and possibly not eating, and I invited them in with the steadiness of a man who refuses to permit strangers to see him rattled, showed them the pantry, the stove, my carefully labeled pill box, answered their questions clearly, even joked that if disorientation looked like this, then perhaps the city should hire me to train new residents how to keep a decent home. And when they left, satisfied, the neighbor across the street was still pretending to adjust her mailbox while filming, and by noon the first text from a church acquaintance arrived, a thinly veiled inquiry about whether I needed assistance deciding things, the greasy language of pity delivered by people who had once eaten my wife's pot roast in the years when we were still visible. By late afternoon the cruelty unfurled its modern banner, because my granddaughter's video of that dinner, edited with jaunty captions and an emoji of a dog with its tongue out, appeared in a group chat screenshot forwarded by someone who mistook gossip for compassion, and although they had muted my face and distorted the audio to a helium squeal, there I was, lifting a fork with a smile pinned to it like a butterfly, while a caption floated, "Grandpa can't tell the difference," and another, "Elevated cuisine," and the laughter emojis ballooned like confetti around a man who had taught her to ride a bicycle. That evening, a dented can with the same tasteful label I had seen by their pantry, heritage beef stew with carrots and brown rice, appeared on my porch like an offering or a warning, and I sat with it in my lap until the metal leached its cold into my palm, and then I took it to the garage and placed it on the tallest shelf, not as evidence, but as an hourglass that would not spill a grain until I turned it. The next day's blows were financial and therefore perfect in their anonymity. A flagged attempt at my bank to add my daughter as a view-only user for safety, a second attempt to change my mailing address to theirs, and a request from a brokerage I had closed years ago asking me to confirm a transfer authorization I had never seen, and I went to the bank in person because the telephone is a weapon that belongs to those who lie without blinking. And then I sat across from a manager who had known my wife's handwriting and my stubborn insistence on passbooks long after the world forgot them, and together we installed codes and phrases and in-person-only flags that transformed my accounts into safes within safes. From there I walked to the clinic and canceled the appointment my daughter had made. Then, in the same breath, I asked for a voluntary, comprehensive cognitive exam, explaining that I expected a storm and preferred to lash my own lines before the wind declared me unseaworthy, and the physician, kind, brisk, unwilling to be used, scheduled me for the following morning, then drew a boundary in clear ink by noting in my chart that all third-party requests must be accompanied by my signature, and I thanked her not as a supplicant, but as an equal in the fight for my name. In the afternoon, because I am old enough to know that rage left untended turns first to rot and then to madness, I went where the air smells of straw and disinfectant and nervous hope, to the county animal shelter where a volunteer named May, whose hair was the color of oatmeal and whose laugh was the noise of a door flung open in summer, placed my hand against the kennel of an elderly terrier with a clouded eye and a chest like a little barrel, and said he had been surrendered when the family moved to a place where dogs were not allowed, a sentence that cut me with its familiarity, because men, too, get surrendered when families move into moral neighborhoods where fathers are not allowed, and I crouched until my knees popped and let the terrier press the soft comma of his nose into my palm. And in that small exchange I felt a steadiness more nourishing than any apology I would never receive. I told May in plain terms that I was considering a legacy, that I wanted to seed something in this place that would endure beyond the foolishness of my bloodline. And she did not ask for numbers, she asked for names, and I said my wife's, and she wrote it on a little card as if the act of writing could stitch the dead into the present. And we spoke about veterinary bills and transport vans and the need for a quiet room where families could say goodbye without fluorescent lights interrogating their grief. And when I left, the terrier's eyes followed me with that mixture of longing and patience I have learned only animals and some widowers can master. The exam the next morning was humiliating in its own way, drawing clocks, remembering sequences, reciting words that have no reason to live together. But I did it without complaint, because armor is sometimes made of paper, and when the neurologist finished, he said he would put his conclusions in writing, and when I asked if the letter might include the phrase decision-making capacity intact, he nodded, the solemn nod of a man who understands that language is a lock and a key at the same time. I walked out with the weird intoxication that comes from proving you are still yourself, and immediately channeled it into paper shields. I visited an elder law attorney whose office smelled faintly of dust jackets and peppermint, a widow in smart shoes who had spent her career rescuing old men from their children, and we drafted a new will, a revocable trust that bore my name and no one else's, beneficiary designations that leapt past the hands that had tried to intercept them, and a letter, not of rage but of clarity, addressed to my daughter and her husband, and kept in escrow with the attorney to be delivered at a time of my choosing. A letter that explained, in sentences long enough to force breath into their reading, that a man who is made to eat with a dog will at last make dogs his heirs, not as spite, but as the most honest translation of the love he was denied. As all that scaffolding rose around me, there was, predictably, a counterattack shaped like concern. They appeared at my door on Sunday with a pastor in tow, a man who had once preached my wife's funeral, and my daughter stood with her hands pressed under her elbows the way she does when rehearsed sincerity is about to spill. And she said they were worried about isolation, that the tests were frightening, that they had been speaking with a care coordinator who could lift the burden of my life from my shoulders. The pastor tried to soften it with talk of community and seasons, and I, who have shoveled driveways through seasons unasked, invited them in, poured coffee I did not intend them to enjoy, and listened until their sentences formed the net they had meant to cast. Then I thanked the pastor and asked if he might step onto the porch with me for just a moment, because the pruning of the hydrangea showed signs of canker. And there I told him quietly that I would not be used as a sermon, that the battlefield was already littered with pamphlets and pity, that I needed only his silence. And to his credit he looked at me for a long second and then nodded and said he would be praying for wisdom, which is what a man says when his hands are clean but his heart is tired. Inside, without the witness of the cloth, their voices rose, my son-in-law, letting his jaw swing open as he explained that taxes were complicated and that he had seen a notice on my counter and would be happy to set up auto pay. And when I told him the notice was a coupon for a window replacement I had no intention of buying, he had the decency to blush. And then my granddaughter, who had placed her phone face down on the table as if that gesture were innocence, asked whether I remembered her. First piano recital, as if memory were a hinge they could loosen with kindness and then swing wide for entry. And I said that I remembered the bow she forgot to take and the way her shoes squeaked on the stage, at which my daughter smiled with relief and moved too close, one hand on the folder she had brought again, and I saw in the twitch of her thumb that she believed the door had finally opened. I did not slam it. I let the moment breathe, because what I planned could not be built on the heat of temper. And I said that the future deserved a table of its own and that I would host them next Sunday, that we would eat and talk and I would bring my papers then, and their faces softened the way faces do when prey steps into the clearing. They hugged me, light, brittle, tactical, and when the door closed behind them I leaned against it until the wood cooled through my shirt, and I knew with the marrow-kind certainty a man gets only a few times in his life that the second act had arrived, and it was mine to direct. The week that followed tried to undo me with small sabotages. A call from the pharmacy explaining someone had tried to change my medication pickup location to a store near my daughter's house. A letter from a non-profit I had never supported thanking me for a pledge made online in my name, a visit from a utility worker who had an order to inspect a leak I had not reported and who shrugged, apologizing when I asked who had called, and in the grocery store my cart was nudged by a stranger who looked at me with the curiosity of someone who recognized my face from a video they would never admit to viewing, and I lowered my eyes not from shame, but to hide the smile rising, because nothing tells you you're on the right path like an opponent, showing you their last arrow before they draw the bow. I bought vegetables that remembered the ground, beef from a butcher who names the farms as if reciting kin, spices my wife once trusted, and from a boutique pet store frequented by women with coiffed dogs wearing sweaters, a selection of the very pâtés and stews my daughter had favored for her animal, as well as a few tins whose labels announced with aspirational typography that they were human grade, all of which I paid for in cash. That has never betrayed anyone who knew how to count. On Friday I visited the shelter again and sat with May in the quiet room, a space with a lamp that made a circle of kindness out of the air, and signed a memorandum of intent that would one day become a plaque not shouting my name but whispering my wife's, and it was there that the old terrier, his name, I learned, was Benny, which is a name only good people give small dogs, placed his paw on my shoe and looked up at me with the politeness of a courtier, asking permission to love, and though I did not take him home that day because plans must ripen, I promised him. And in promising him I felt my spine straighten, as if my body were a flag and the promise a wind lifting it. Saturday evening, as the sun fell behind the roofline and painted my living room the color of a bruise healing, my phone lit with a message from my daughter that said simply, "We're bringing the pastor again. It helps." And I replied with a single sentence that I reread 5 times to ensure it contained no heat a lawyer could later ignite. "Only family for this conversation, please." And after a long pause, she replied, "Of course," which told me the battle had finally forced them to step on too, the plane where a man's voice, unadorned by witnesses, must fight on its own merits. I set the table carefully, using the good plates my wife kept for company who never came after she was gone, polished the forks until they flashed like small moons, placed a vase with 3 chrysanthemums at the center because she loved odd numbers and flowers, and in the kitchen I organized the cans and the stock and the butter into stations like a general arranging regiments, not with malice but with attention, because justice is not a mood, it is a craft. That night, when the house was quiet and the plan lay across my mind like a map etched in phosphorescence, I sat at the desk and wrote one more letter, this one to myself, a promise that I would not let rage spoil the precise mercy I intended to deliver, a reminder that it was not my place to destroy them but to reveal them, and then to remove the reward they believed they were owed. I folded the letter and placed it beneath the tasteful can I had kept on the high shelf, like a foundation. Stone under a monument no one else would understand, and only then did sleep arrive, deep and clean. Not the collapse of a hunted man, but the rest of someone who has set the table for his own rescue. They arrived on the dot of 6 with smiles pressed onto their faces like labels on jars, the kind that peel at the corners when the room gets warm, and I opened the door as if the hinges had never learned to complain, invited them into a house that smelled of butter and thyme and something darker beneath, and guided them past the hallway where the photos of our better years hung like witnesses who had sworn to tell the truth. My daughter carried a folder again, and my son-in-law a bottle with a label loud enough to serve as a personality, and the grandchildren drifted behind them with the casual entitlement of tourists who expect the scenery to applaud. And I said that before we sat I wanted to show them something new in the kitchen, and they laughed because men my age do not get new things, but they followed. And I lifted the lid on the small Dutch oven where a sauce ticked softly as it released its steam, and I let them smell what patience smells like when it has been tended and not devoured, and I said without ceremony that I had been thinking about family recipes, the way certain tastes bind people together across years of neglect and temper, and I watched my daughter's mouth form the question she thought was sympathy, but was really reconnaissance. Would I be sentimental tonight, pliable, ready to sign? Then I set the lid back and invited them to the dining room where I had laid the table with my wife's good plates and the heavy silver that remembers wrists and anniversaries, where a low arrangement of chrysanthemums kept the light from breaking itself on crystal, where seats had been placed with the arithmetic of old courtesy, my daughter to my right, because she is still my daughter, my son-in-law opposite, because a man should face what he has done, and the children near each other so their giggles would not ricochet through my skull. I served them myself because service is an art they never learned, slipping a pale terrine onto warm toast points with a ribbon of parsley to remind the eye that care had been taken, spooning the glossy sauce over potatoes that had been whisked until they sighed, laying slices of roast that bled only dignity, and when they raised their forks and said, "How lovely, how tender, how refined," I poured the wine with a hand steady enough to write its own affidavit, and I asked in a voice smooth as the gravy whether the seasoning suited them, whether the texture pleased them, whether they appreciated the depth, and my granddaughter said with the decisive cleverness of the untested that it tasted like something you'd pay extra for at a place with a parking valet, and my grandson, who has learned to love his own sarcasm, said it was elevated. And my son-in-law said that at last the old man had learned a few things from YouTube, and in that moment, with their mouths busy and their eyes pleased, I felt the hinge in the room swing, quiet and irrevocable. I did not keep them waiting for the door to shut. I stood, walked to the sideboard where the folder I had brought to the table earlier lay beneath the linen like a knife under the napkin, and placed on the cloth 3 objects that did not belong to the choreography of a family dinner. First, a sealed letter on the letterhead of the neurologist stating in the clean geometry of medicine that my judgment and memory were intact, and that any assertion to the contrary should be considered malicious or misinformed. Second, a thick envelope bearing the stamp of my attorney, inside which waited a copy of my newly executed trust and will, instruments that gathered every account, policy, and right of survivorship into a house no one at that table held a key to, and named, in lines that would outlive whispers, a small list of beneficiaries that included not a human in that room, but a foundation to be established the day I died in my wife's name for the county animal shelter. Third, and last, the can. It was the beautiful can, the tasteful one from their pantry, the one that looked more like a craft beer than food for a creature who licks a floor to show gratitude, and I set it between the candlesticks as if it were a centerpiece and tapped its rim with my fingernail until the metal answered in a little bell that drew all their eyes. My daughter tried to smile and failed. She recognized her own brand the way a thief recognizes his reflection, and she said something about a joke, about how very funny, about how we should not be dramatic. But I did not let the moment skid away. I told them calmly that the terrine they had praised and the sauce they had loved were made from the same human-grade tins she buys for the dog, she says, eats better than most people. And I let the words stay on the table among the knives and the crumbs, and I watched comprehension soak into their faces like broth into stale bread. And I saw my granddaughter's hand move toward her phone, only to hesitate because no filter could make this palatable. My son-in-law spat into his napkin, theater rather than necessity. He accused me of endangering them, and I lifted the label I had slit from a second can and read aloud the list of ingredients, more honest in its enumeration than any story told. About me this past year, and I told him that nothing had endangered them except the appetite they had cultivated for humiliating others, and that tonight I wanted them to feel, on the tongue and under the skin, the proximity between contempt and consumption, the way mockery tries to turn a person into an animal in order to justify what is taken from him. My daughter swore that this was cruelty, that I had gone too far, that serving them dog food was an unforgivable act, and I let her finish because I have learned that righteous certainty arrives winded. Then I told her that I had fed them nothing, would not eat myself if I considered the company worthy, but that I had chosen not to eat tonight, because fasting clarifies and because I wanted the memory to belong entirely to them. Before she could gather her outrage into another spear, I slid. The neurologist led her across the cloth so she could stab her eyes on words that would not bend. And then I placed the trust documents beside her wine glass and said that moving forward there would be no more requests, no more arrangements, no more emergency calls about tuition or tires or taxes, that the legacy of my years would bypass their hands without malice, only accuracy, and that if they ever wondered why, they could consult the can. My son-in-law reached for the papers with the casual entitlement of a man who expects every sheet to obey him, and I told him gently not to bother, that the originals were with counsel and the accounts already retitled, that failing the laws of the land he had tried to leverage against me, there was now nothing to be gained here but honesty, and as he began to rise, I raised my hand, palm open, not to command, but to bless a silence into being, and I said, I had one more thing to present, and I whistled the small whistle I had not used since the dog of my youth would come running, dust-footed across the yard. From the hallway came the soft click of small nails on hardwood, and the old terrier, newly bathed, wearing a red collar with a brass tag that already knew my house by heart, trotted into the room and sat at my heel as if he had been doing it for years. The grandchildren softened because some goodness still lives even in soil salted with scorn, but my daughter looked stricken, and I stroked the dog's head and said that his name was Benny, and that he and I would be visiting the shelter often, because there were things to be built in my wife's name, a transport van to carry animals out of danger, a quiet room with soft light, and a better kind of goodbye than most people get, a fund for medical care when cruelty or poverty did the work that indifference finishes, and that this was not vengeance but tender arithmetic, the balancing of a ledger they had put in the red for years. And then, because clarity without consequence is only a lecture, I told them that I had recorded the audio of that earlier dinner in their house, the mocking, the captions they rehearsed aloud before publishing, the sound of a can being opened not for an animal, and that file now lived with the same attorney who held my trust, not for the Internet's pleasure, but for the plain utility of the truth should any court again be asked to decide whether I needed guardians for my mind. They exploded then, not with shame but with noise, my son-in-law launching into legalisms he did not understand, my daughter demanding the return of a father she believed was still in reach, so long as signatures remained loose, the grandchildren, pleading for the story to be deleted because they had not meant harm, it was a joke, they were young, and I listened because listening is the last luxury of the old. Then I stood, lifted my glass of water, clear, undecorated, faithful, and said that the door would be open for them when respect was their first language, not their last resort, that the pastor need not come, that my doctor had already visited, that my papers were set, that my table would remain here and I would be eating well, and as I walked them to the threshold I handed my daughter the can, not as a trophy, but as a mirror, and I asked her to keep it on her counter where her conscience could reach it. On the porch, with the light coming on because habit is a good servant even when hope resigns, they tried one more time to gather me into the familiar net of obligation and fear, and I cut it with a sentence I had had to live to earn. You fed me as if I were less than a man, and now the hungry will be fed in my name, not yours. Then I closed the door on their astonishment, and the dog curled against my slipper, and at last the house exhaled. And somewhere beneath the floorboards I felt the old timbers settle around a truth that had found its shape. In the days that followed, I discovered that a house can learn to breathe again when fear is shown the door, because the morning after I closed it on my family, the rooms filled with the plain smell of coffee and dog shampoo and the small, hopeful sounds of Benny's paws investigating corners my wife once dusted, and I walked him through streets that had watched me age without speaking, and felt, to my own surprise, not triumphant or vindicated, but simply level, as if the ground had finally stopped tilting under the weight of other people's appetites. The calls came, as I knew they would. First the hot ones full of sputtered accusations about reputation and betrayal and what I owed to blood. Then the colder ones chipped out of legalese and old grievances, and I answered none of them because silence is not the absence of an answer, but sometimes the only answer that refuses to lie. And when a letter finally arrived without a return address containing the very can I had pressed into, and old grievances, and I answered none of them because silence is not the absence of an answer, but sometimes the only answer that refuses to lie, and when a letter finally arrived without a return address containing the very can I had pressed into any longer, which I read twice before putting the can on the highest shelf of the pantry, where objects that once controlled me now serve as reminders rather than masters. Through the grapevine that passes for community, I heard that the video of my humiliation had been removed, not with apology, but with the tidy explanation that context was missing, and I let that phrase pass through me like smoke, because context is the last privilege, the cruel claim when they are caught, and I did not need the Internet's cooperation to feel restored when the neurologist's letter arrived with that hard, simple sentence about intact judgment, a line so clean it might as well have been a keel I could balance on while the waves of rumor spent themselves on the sand. Benny and I kept our appointments at the shelter where May showed me a corner room with a window that looked onto an oak whose leaves clung stubbornly through the first snow, and we stood together in the quiet afternoon while a contractor measured, and a volunteer held a handful of fabric swatches up to the light, and when May asked what the plaque should say, I said to write my wife's name without dates, because she has never really left the rooms I inhabit, and to add only the small sentence. She used to whisper to nervous dogs and to me when the world gnawed at the edges of our patience, which was that everyone gets to go home, and I signed a first installment check that did not hurt to write, because money, when it moves toward kindness, stops being a ransom and becomes a key. On Sundays I set one extra cup on the table out of a habit, and then poured the coffee back into the pot without bitterness, and I learned the roots of the neighborhood like a postman of my own days, stopping to tie a loose swing in the park to show a boy how to oil a squeaky chain, to accept a jar of late peaches from a widow who had noticed the way Benny sat when I told him to wait, and who said it was nice to see a man insist on manners when the world had forgotten them. In the evenings I reopened the piano and discovered that while my fingers had lost agility, they had not lost reverence, and I played scales that sounded like someone sweeping a chapel after a long service, which turned out to be all the prayer I needed. There were attempts, of course, because people who have eaten for years at a table, they did not rarely accept that the kitchen is no longer theirs. A call from a banker asking if I intended to rescind the access I had never granted. A postcard from a retirement community with my name pre-printed on a tour date I had not scheduled. A message relayed through a church lady that an apology might be forthcoming if only we could agree to meet halfway, which made me smile because the halfway point between cruelty and respect is still cruelty, and I am too old to live in fractions. Yet there were also small corrections I could not have predicted, like the afternoon I found my granddaughter on the shelter's website, not in a post or a plea, but in the volunteer schedule where her name sat for a 2-hour shift on a Wednesday. And when I asked May later, without explanation, whether a very young woman with a hard mouth had shown up and worked the laundry, she said that a girl had folded towels as if neatness might save her life, and that no one had asked her to smile, and no one had punished her when she didn't. And that was the first moment I allowed myself to consider that remorse might be learning to speak inside a house where mockery had once held the only microphone. I do not script redemption for other people anymore. I barely script it for myself. I simply keep the door open at the hours I have written on a paper by the phone. Mornings for walks and coffee, afternoons for errands and shelter work, evenings for music and letters. And if anyone I once called mine wants to arrive during those hours with the first sentence already in their mouth that says not what they want, but what they are ready to repair, I will listen, and if they do not, then a life can be full without the echoes of those who chose absence, because benches in the park and pews in the shelter and the worn cushion by the piano all hold their shape under the weight of an old man and a small dog. The trust is inked and sleeping in its drawer like a well-trained guard. The accounts sit in their safes like obedient animals waiting to be released toward causes that do not laugh when no one is looking. The folder my daughter once pushed toward me has been replaced on my sideboard by a jar of biscuits shaped like bones that Benny has learned to take only when told, and the can on the high shelf remains where it belongs, a lighthouse turned inward reminding me that humiliation did not drown me, but showed me where the rocks were. At night I step onto the porch and the air smells of damp leaves and gasoline and distant dinners, and I tell my wife what happened that day in the same tone I once used to tell her a joke I knew she would stretch. With her laughter, and when the house settles around us, I understand that justice, when it finally arrives, is not a shout, but a returning silence in which a man can hear his own name clearly, and that love, when it cannot flow down the old channels, will find a new bed and run there just as stubbornly. So I end as I began. At the kitchen table where the mornings are honest and the coffee is strong, with Benny asleep against my slipper and the sun lifting its slow coin over the fence. And I think of the sentence my daughter once flung at me like a verdict that I would die alone if I kept choosing pride over family, and I measure it against the room I inhabit now, against the steady weight of a dog who has chosen me back, against the handwriting on the shelter's architectural plan that carries my wife's name forward into a room where people will whisper goodbye without shame, and I say to the quiet that dying alone is not the fear I was taught to hold, that living without dignity is the only real loneliness, and that in the end, the people who served me what they thought I deserved taught me how to feed the world something better, which is a lesson even a tired heart can carry without trembling. My wife's name forward into a room where people will whisper goodbye without shame, and I say to the quiet that dying alone is not the fear I was taught to hold, that living without dignity is the only real loneliness, and that in the end, the people who served me what they thought I deserved taught me how to feed the world something better, which is a lesson even a tired heart can carry without trembling.